So, let me get this straight, Bob said, scratching his head. You want a wall, a stone wall, around your entire yard, and you want it to look old? Ancient, I corrected. Historically inspired? Think Roman, think medieval, think Hadrian's Wall meets King Arthur's castle. Bob stared at me for a moment, then burst out laughing. You're serious, aren't you? Dead serious, I said. I have issues with my HOA. I can see that, Bob said, still chuckling. All right, let's do it. But don't blame me if people start calling your house the fortress. I'm a man of simple pleasures. A good book, a comfortable chair, and a well-behaved dog. That's all I ask for. The dog, in this case, is a fluffy white Bichon Frise named Fluffy Butt. My daughter named him, don't judge. And Fluffy Butt, despite his diminutive size and generally angelic demeanor, has a penchant for exploring. Which is why I needed a fence. A simple, practical picket fence. Nothing fancy, just something to keep Fluffy Butt from embarking on unauthorized expeditions into the neighbor's rose bushes. I live in Heritage Hills, a neighborhood that takes its name very seriously. It's a pleasant enough place, with well-maintained homes and tree-lined streets. But there's an undercurrent of historical obsession that permeates everything. Up until now, I'd mostly avoided any major conflicts with the homeowners association. A few friendly reminders about lawn maintenance, a gentle suggestion to repaint my mailbox a more period-appropriate color, nothing I couldn't handle. But the fence, it seemed, was about to change all that. I submitted my fence plans to the HOA, as required. It was a standard white picket fence, the kind you see in countless suburban yards across America. Nothing offensive, nothing extravagant, just a simple, functional barrier. I expected a quick approval. What I got was a rejection notice. Fence design does not conform to the historical aesthetic of Heritage Hills, I read aloud, my voice laced with disbelief. Historical aesthetic? What historical aesthetic? We live in suburban Ohio, not colonial Williamsburg. I reread the notice, searching for some kind of explanation, some kind of logic. There was none. Just a vague, pretentious pronouncement about historical integrity. It sounded utterly made up. My initial reaction was confusion. Was this a joke? Had I accidentally stumbled into a historical reenactment society? But the confusion quickly morphed into annoyance, and then into a growing suspicion. This wasn't about history, it was about control. It was about the HOA, and specifically, I suspected, one particular member of the HOA, flexing its arbitrary, historically obsessed muscles. The HOA meeting was held in the Heritage Hills Community Center, a building that, ironically, looked like it had been built in the 1970s. The meeting room, however, had been decorated to reflect the neighborhood's supposed historical theme. There were faux antique portraits on the walls, heavy velvet drapes on the windows, and a chandelier that looked suspiciously like it came from a discount lighting store. The board members sat at a long table, looking like a collection of extras from a low-budget historical drama. There was a man wearing a powdered wig, that was clearly askew, a woman in a bonnet that looked like it had been attacked by a flock of angry pigeons, and a couple of others who looked like they'd raided a costume shop's Colonial America section. And then there was Priscilla Thistlewick, the president of the Heritage Hills HOA and the self-proclaimed guardian of our neighborhood's historical integrity. She was an older woman, dressed in what I can only describe as a colonial Victorian Renaissance fair mashup outfit. It involved a long, flowing skirt, a ruffled blouse, a bonnet that defied both gravity and good taste, and an expression that suggested she'd just smelled something unpleasant. She carried herself with an air of authority that was entirely unearned, as if she were a queen surveying her, decidedly unhistorical, kingdom. Next item, Priscilla announced, her voice dripping with disdain. "Mr. Arthur Pendleton's fence." She said fence as if it were a four-letter word. "It's just a picket fence, Miss Thistlewick," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "A simple white picket fence, to keep my dog from wandering." Priscilla fixed me with a steely gaze. "A picket fence, Mr. Pendleton," she declared, her voice rising in pitch, "is utterly inappropriate for Heritage Hills. It is modern, it is common. It is an affront to our historical heritage." "But it's a picket fence," I repeated, feeling a sense of bewildered frustration. "They've been around for centuries. I chose white specifically to not stand out." "Heritage Hills," Priscilla continued, ignoring my comment, "must maintain its historical integrity. We are a living museum, a testament to the... She seemed to be searching for the right historical reference. "The spirit of 70s colonial Williamsburg." "A living museum?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "With cars and satellite dishes and those inflatable holiday decorations that Mr. Henderson puts up every year?" I gestured towards a man on the board who was wearing a suspiciously modern-looking wristwatch. A few nervous coughs echoed through the room. Priscilla's face turned a shade of red that clashed violently with her, presumably, historically inaccurate lipstick. "Those are minor concessions to modernity, Mr. Pendleton," she sputtered. "Your fence, on the other hand, is a blatant disregard for our community's aesthetic guidelines." "But the guidelines don't say anything about picket fences," I pointed out, pulling out a copy of the HOA rule book, which I'd, of course, thoroughly studied. "They talk about appropriate materials and harmonious design. I think a white picket fence is perfectly harmonious." "Harmony," Priscilla declared, "is not achieved with mass-produced lumber and modern construction techniques. We must strive for authenticity, for... She trailed off, clearly grasping at straws. "For what, Miss Thistlewick?" I asked, my voice laced with sarcasm. "For a historically inaccurate recreation of a time period that never actually existed? For a neighborhood filled with identical houses and people dressed in... that?" I gestured towards her outfit. Priscilla slammed her, presumably plastic, gavel down. "The fence," she declared, her voice shaking with rage, "is denied. Period." "Okay, Priscilla. No picket fence? Fine, I'd play her game. But I wouldn't play by her rules. I'd play by history's rules. Sort of." That night, fueled by a potent mixture of frustration, indignation, and a growing sense of mischievous glee, I started researching. Not fences, oh no. I went bigger. I started researching walls, ancient walls, medieval walls, Roman walls, fortifications, battlements, crenellations, moats. My internet search history quickly looked like a syllabus for a course on defensive architecture through the ages. I was fascinated. I mean, I'd always appreciated a good castle, but now I was studying them, analyzing them, deconstructing them. And, as I delved deeper into the world of historical fortifications, I realized something. These things were awesome. And, more importantly, they were the antithesis of everything Priscilla Thistlewick stood for. They were massive, imposing, and utterly impractical for a modern suburban neighborhood, which, of course, made them perfect. Hadrian's Wall kept coming up. That seemed like a great place to draw inspiration. I mean, if it's good enough to keep out the Picts and the Scots, surely it was good enough to keep out Karen. It was perfect. I would use all of them. A bit of Roman, a dash of medieval, a sprinkle of whatever else I could find. It would be a historical mess. A glorious, beautiful, utterly ridiculous mess. And it would all be in the name of historical accuracy, of course. The HOA bylaws. My weapon of choice. I reread them, cover to cover, multiple times. I highlighted, underlined, and annotated every relevant passage. And then I found it. Buried deep within a section on exterior structures and landscaping was a vague, ambiguous clause about maintaining the historical character of Heritage Hills. It talked about appropriate materials, harmonious design, and structures that reflect the historical context of the community. There was a specific prohibition against modern fences that did not meet these guidelines. But, and this was the key, there was nothing about ancient stone walls. Historical context, I muttered, a slow grin spreading across my face. Oh, I'll give them historical context. It was a loophole big enough to drive a Roman chariot through. And I, Arthur Pendleton, was about to do just that. My plan was simple, in theory, but ludicrous in execution. I would build a wall. Not just any wall, but a massive stone wall. An ancient stone wall. A wall that would encircle my entire property. A monument to my defiance. A testament to my slightly unhinged determination to get back at Priscilla Thistlewick. But it wouldn't be just a wall. It would be a historical recreation. A mishmash of different architectural styles, deliberately anachronistic and utterly over the top. I'd have Roman arches, medieval crenellations, maybe even a small, non-functional moat. More of a decorative ditch, really. It would be a glorious, beautiful, historically inaccurate mess. And I would claim, with a perfectly straight face, that it was all in the name of preserving the historical character of Heritage Hills. I could already picture Priscilla's face, her perfectly coiffed hair practically standing on end, her eyes bulging with outrage. The thought made me giddy with anticipation. Construction day. It was less construction and more organized chaos. I'd hired a local stonemason, a burly guy named Bob, who seemed both amused and slightly bewildered by my request. So, let me get this straight, Bob said, scratching his head. You want a wall, a stone wall, around your entire yard, and you want it to look old? Ancient, I corrected. Historically inspired. Think Roman, think medieval, think Hadrian's Wall meets King Arthur's castle. Bob stared at me for a moment, then burst out laughing. You're serious, aren't you? Dead serious, I said. I have issues with my HOA. I can see that, Bob said, still chuckling. All right, let's do it. But don't blame me if people start calling your house the fortress. The first delivery arrived. Tons of massive stones, rough-hewn and unevenly shaped. I'd specifically requested rustic materials to give the wall that authentic, built by a bunch of guys in togas look. Then came the sand, the gravel, the cement, and a small army of workers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else than assembling my ridiculous wall. The construction process was a spectacle. The stones were heavy, unwieldy, and deliberately not uniform. We weren't building a sleek, modern wall. We were building a ruin, a beautiful, glorious ruin. I incorporated elements from various historical periods, a section of Roman-style arches here, a stretch of medieval crenellations there, a random assortment of stones that looked like they'd been salvaged from a collapsed castle. The neighbors, of course, were fascinated. They gathered on their lawns, watching the construction with a mixture of confusion, amusement, and growing concern. "What is he doing?" I heard one whisper. "Is that a wall?" another asked. "It looks like a castle," a third said, sounding slightly alarmed. Fluffybutt, meanwhile, was utterly bewildered. He spent most of the day running around the yard, barking at the workers, getting underfoot, and generally adding to the chaos. My internal monologue was a constant stream of giddy anticipation. "Wait until Priscilla sees this," I muttered to myself over and over again. "She's going to lose her mind." There were, of course, a few minor setbacks. A delivery of stones got delayed, causing a temporary work stoppage. One of the workers accidentally dropped a large stone on his foot. He was fine, thankfully. And, at one point, a representative from the HOA, not Priscilla, thankfully, she was probably still recovering from the fence meeting, showed up, looking confused and vaguely threatening. "What is this?" he asked, gesturing towards the half-built wall. "It's a historical recreation," I said, with a perfectly straight face. "A tribute to the rich architectural heritage of, this area." He stared at me, speechless, then shook his head and walked away. I took that as a win, but despite the minor hiccups, the wall continued to rise, steadily, inexorably, transforming my ordinary suburban yard into something extraordinary, something ridiculous, something perfectly, beautifully, historically inaccurate, and I, Arthur Pendleton, was the architect of it all, the mad genius behind the wall, and I couldn't wait to see Priscilla's reaction. The unveiling of Arthur's Folly, as I'd affectionately nicknamed my wall, was a moment I'd been anticipating with glee, and Priscilla Thistlewick did not disappoint. She arrived, predictably, in a flurry of outrage, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. She stood there, on the sidewalk, staring at my wall, her mouth agape, her eyes bulging. It was a beautiful sight. "What?" she finally managed to choke out, her voice a strangled whisper that quickly escalated into a shriek. "Have you done?" I emerged from behind the wall, strolling casually towards her, a picture of calm composure. "Good afternoon, Priscilla," I said, my voice smooth and even. "You're admiring my wall, I see." This is an abomination," she sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at the towering structure. It looks like a ruin." "It's a historical recreation, Priscilla," I corrected with a perfectly straight face. "A tribute to the rich architectural heritage of various historical periods." "Historical recreation?" she repeated, her voice reaching a pitch that only dogs could probably hear. "It's a monstrosity. It's preposterous." "I think it's rather charming," I said with a shrug. "Perfectly compliant with the HOA's historical aesthetic, I might add. Remember that clause? Structures appropriate to the historical context?" Priscilla's eyes narrowed. You did this on purpose," she accused, her voice shaking with rage. "On purpose," I repeated, feigning innocence. "I simply wanted to enhance my property with a historically inspired structure. I call it Arthur's Folly." "It's a folly, all right," she snapped. "A complete and utter folly." I then proceeded to give her a tour of the wall, pointing out its various and deliberately inaccurate historical features. "See these arches," I said, gesturing towards a section of the wall that looked vaguely Roman. "Inspired by the aqueducts of ancient Rome. Very impressive, don't you think? And these," I continued, pointing to a series of jagged, unevenly spaced crenellations along the top. "Classic medieval castle design. Perfect for defending against invading hordes, or, overly zealous HOA presidents." Priscilla was speechless. She just stared at the wall, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "And over there," I said, pointing towards a small, muddy ditch I'd dug along a section of the wall, "is the moat. Still a work in progress, of course. I'm thinking of adding some alligators, or maybe just some very aggressive goldfish." Priscilla finally found her voice, although it was barely a whisper. You can't do this," she stammered. I'll shut this down. I'll have this thing demolished." She turned and stormed off, her historical outfit billowing dramatically behind her. The emergency HOA meeting was, predictably, a circus. Priscilla, looking like she hadn't slept in days, probably because she'd been too busy plotting my demise, launched into a furious tirade, accusing me of everything from violating the spirit of Heritage Hills to creating a public safety hazard to single-handedly destroying the neighborhood's property values. "It's a wall!" she shrieked, her voice echoing through the still faux antique community center. "A giant, ugly, historically inaccurate wall. It's an insult to everything we stand for." "Actually," I said, calmly addressing the board, "it's perfectly legal. I presented my case. The bylaws, specifically the glorious loophole of Rule Number 14C, the building permits, all properly obtained, and my interpretation of the HOA's beloved historical aesthetic. I even produced a historical document, a hastily drawn sketch on a piece of parchment that I'd aged with tea bags, depicting a wall that looked suspiciously like mine, with the caption, "Ancient Roman Medieval Whatever Fortress circa whenever." The other board members were a mixed bag. Some were clearly intimidated by Priscilla, nodding along to her every rant. Others looked confused, bewildered by the whole situation. And a few, I suspected, were secretly amused. Then, Mr. Henderson, the real historian, not the firewood-stealing one, a quiet, unassuming man who lived down the street, spoke up. "Priscilla," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I've studied history for over 40 years, and I have to say, your interpretation of historical accuracy is, well, it's creative." He then turned to me, a twinkle in his eye. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, "your wall is certainly unique. While I can't say it's historically accurate, I must admit it has a certain charm, a certain audacity." Priscilla sputtered, speechless. The board, sensing a shift in the wind and a potential lawsuit, voted to table the discussion, pending further investigation. The meeting ended in a stalemate, with Priscilla looking like she was about to spontaneously combust, and me feeling a surge of triumphant and slightly smug satisfaction. But the war, as they say, was far from over. What followed was a period of escalating absurdity that I can only describe as the Siege of Heritage Hills. Priscilla, obsessed with bringing down my wall, launched a full-scale assault. She complained to the city, claiming the wall was a safety hazard, a structural abomination, and a violation of countless building codes. City inspectors came, they measured, they inspected, and they found nothing. The wall was perfectly legal. She organized protests. Well, protest is a strong word. It was more like a handful of her loyal and increasingly dwindling supporters standing on the sidewalk, holding up poorly made signs that read, "Down with the wall," and "Make Heritage Hills beige again." She even, I suspect, attempted some minor vandalism. I found a few scratches on one of the stones, easily buffed out, and a suspicious-looking stain that looked suspiciously like prune juice. Priscilla was a known prune enthusiast. Of course, I had security cameras everywhere, capturing her every move, and I, of course, responded in kind. I added a guard tower to the wall, really just a small wooden platform with a railing, perfect for enjoying a morning cup of coffee and surveying my domain. I installed a completely non-functional trebuchet on my lawn, aimed directly at Priscilla's house. I flew a ridiculous medieval banner from the top of the wall, depicting a fluffy white dog rampant on a field of green, a tribute to Fluffybutt, of course. And because why not, I hosted a medieval feast in my backyard, inviting all the neighbors, except Priscilla, naturally. We had roast chicken, giant turkey legs, and plenty of mead. Actually just apple cider, but don't tell anyone. I even dressed up as a king, wearing a plastic crown and wielding a foam sword. It was a glorious, ridiculous, utterly over-the-top spectacle. The neighbors loved it. The local news even showed up, filming a segment about the Great Wall of Heritage Hills. And Priscilla? She just got angrier and more desperate and more soaked. Because, of course, the sprinklers were still in place, and they were still accidentally going off whenever she got too close. It was the little things, you know? It's been a year since the Siege of Heritage Hills, as it's now, affectionately, I think, known in the neighborhood. And I have to say, life behind the wall has been interesting. Arthur's Folly, my magnificent, historically inaccurate, HOA loophole-exploiting San wall, still stands. It's become more than just a wall. It's a landmark. A tourist attraction, a minor one, but still. A constant source of amusement, for everyone except, presumably, Priscilla Thistlewick. People actually drive by just to see it. I've seen families posing for pictures in front of it, kids pretending to be knights storming a castle, and even a few history buffs, bless their hearts, trying to identify the various architectural styles. I've even started giving impromptu tours, explaining the completely fabricated history of the wall, pointing out the Roman arches, the medieval crenellations, and the ancient mystical energy that emanates from the stones. It's just limestone, but don't tell anyone. Priscilla? She's gone. Vanished. Sold her house and moved away, presumably to a community with no historical pretensions whatsoever. I heard a rumor that she's now living in a modern, minimalist condo complex surrounded by concrete and glass. I can only imagine how that's going for her. Heritage Hills, as a whole, has undergone a subtle but significant transformation. There's a newfound appreciation for historical inaccuracy, a greater tolerance for individuality, a sense that maybe, just maybe, it's okay to have a little fun, to be a little different, to build a giant, ridiculous wall around your property if you feel like it. A new family moved into Priscilla's old house a few months ago. The new neighbor, a friendly guy named Mark, stopped by one afternoon while I was, inspecting my wall, making sure the trebuchet was still properly aimed, of course. "So," Mark said, gesturing towards the imposing structure with a bewildered expression, "why do you have a medieval castle wall around your house?" I grinned, leaning against a particularly large and particularly non-historical stone. "Oh," I said casually, "just an HOA misunderstanding." Mark blinked. Misunderstanding?" "Yeah," I said, nodding. "Long story. Involves a picket fence, a fluffy white dog, and a woman with a very strong opinion about historical accuracy. Let's just say things escalated." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "Well," he said, "I think it's amazing. It certainly gives the neighborhood character." "That's what I told them," I replied, feeling a surge of pride. "And it keeps the riffraff out. Or at least it keeps certain HOA presidents out." And as I stood there, in the shadow of my magnificent, ridiculous wall, the sun setting behind it, casting long, dramatic shadows across my, now HOA-approved lawn, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I'd fought the good fight. I'd defended my right to have a wall. And I'd won. The HOA was still around, of course, but they were different. More cautious, more respectful. And definitely less likely to mess with my property, but just in case, I've been brainstorming some new additions. Maybe a dragon for the top of the wall, a smoke machine, some strategically placed red lights, and a recorded roar that activates whenever someone approaches the gate. Or perhaps a series of hidden speakers that play medieval battle music at random intervals. The possibilities are endless. And as long as there are HOAs and overly zealous rule enforcers, I, Arthur Pendleton, defender of the historically inaccurate, will be ready. Bring on the next challenge. My wall and my imagination are ready.